Hello fellow cyborgs, and welcome to another mini update. Today I'm going to tell you about the recent reads that I have managed to finish, and that's what I'm going to do. So let's get started. So continuing with the Bronte Binge 2019 project, I reread The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Let me say, this for a while there was a pretty arduous task, but the end, it was really good, and I appreciated this so much more upon rereading than I did when I first read it. I will talk about this in detail in the Bronte Binge video that should be up at the same time as this video, so if you want to hear more of my thoughts, then check it out. But just to sum up, this was a 3-star read when I first read it, and now it is a hearty 4-star read. Check out my other video if you want to hear more. If you saw my recent book haul video, you know that I added 3 volumes to my bookshelf, and you know that it's all Libby Stevenson's fault, but in like the best way possible. So I have been definitely almost on creeper levels watching Libby's channel. It's almost unhealthy at this point. But the good news is that the byproduct is not aberrant behavior, but reading of classical literature. I decided to pick up the Oresteia from my local library. This is a trilogy of ancient Greek tragedies by Aeschylus, and my copy is fairly modern translation by Alan Shapiro and Peter H. Burian. This title has since kicked off more exploration into ancient Greek plays, specifically tragedies. Yep, I've only read sad things so far, but that's what I like. So the Oresteia takes place after the Trojan War, when Agamemnon, who was one of the main generals for the Greek army in the Trojan War, has finally come home. But unfortunately, he had to sacrifice his eldest daughter to the god Artemis in order for he and his ships to actually travel to Troy in the first place 10 years ago. And his wife, Clytemnestra, has been able to stew over this fact for the past decade. Murder ensues, as you could probably guess. So one thing that I didn't expect was how gruesome these plays were. It could be the translation. It could just be that Aeschylus was a gloomy dude, but it gets really gory, and I kind of loved it. I also really liked how, even though I could tell that this was a pretty contemporary translation and some of the word choice wasn't as archaic as it could have been to make me feel like I was reading ancient literature, the kind of combination of words and the way that the lines and sentences were built did really put me back in that zone. One really strange thing that I had a hard time getting over was the stage directions, which, I mean, this copy didn't really have stage directions, but a lot of what the chorus says is split up into strophes, antistrophes, and epodes. And when I Wikipedia'd what that meant, it meant that the chorus would move from east to west, and then move from west to east, and then stand in the middle of the stage. And so I kept just imagining these packs of old dudes, women, and furies just it just seems very silly when I was trying to imagine it. So I think that kind of tripped me up a little bit, but as one of my friends on Goodreads, Dimitri, said, you just kind of have to modern it up in your mind and just not think about it quite like that. But even so, I mean, there was a lot of really good stuff. I need my own copy, I feel because there's a lot of things that I wanted to bracket and share with you and then neglected to do it before I got back to the library. So I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, but I think having read a few more Greek plays, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes, this is probably more of a 4-star read, but I'll let my reread be my guide with that star change. But I really enjoyed this quite a bit. It was a very, very pleasant surprise. So thank you, Libby, for making me read it. Then I finally finished Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff, which again, I got from my library. So pretty picture for you to look at. So this is a novel, but it reads more like interconnected short stories that do have an overarching plot. But I found that reading experiences was really, really good. The only downside is if you get really attached to Atticus, who's the main character in the first short story, which is frankly more novella length. It's about 100 pages. If you get really attached to him, he doesn't really come up that much. He doesn't play that big of a role in the rest of the book. But the cool news is that you get introduced to Atticus and his really interesting family, and each short story explores one of them in more detail. I was really impressed at the civil rights issues and the prejudices against Black people that were really well touched on in this book, though it definitely makes me like, I kind of feel a little squicky about this book having been written by a white man, and also that I enjoyed this book much more than some of the books dealing with same topics that were written by Black people. It makes me kind of feel like an awful person. In any case, I did like super enjoy Lovecraft Country. I think it made me think about things with the Jim Crow era I haven't thought about before. I thought it was respectfully done. I thought it was really well done, and I really liked the like metaphysical horror as well. This is definitely more about, I would have to say, the civil rights issues, and then you have like the flavor of metaphysical horror on top. Is that even the right term? I don't know. It's Lovecraft-ish horror. So if you're coming to Lovecraft Country from being a Lovecraft lover, I think you'll be kind of annoyed. Not 100% sure. But if you're coming at this from like, I wanted to explore that Jim Crow era, I think you'll be quite impressed. So yeah, this was like hands down a 4 to 5 star read. It was super enjoyable, really easy to get through, but definitely not a simple read by any means. And then I read Richard II by William Shakespeare because Libby is doing it for the Bard Book Club this month, and I feel like for the foreseeable future I will probably be joining in on the Bard Book Club reads every month, so look forward to me talking about more Shakespeare that I probably didn't fully understand. Not that I didn't understand what was going on, but I just think that I miss a lot of the like detailed gems that Libby picks up on from, I think, her like, she's studied language and sentences and stuff a lot more than I have in university. I was a psych major, not an English major or a language major. So Richard II is the story pretty much about the downfall of Richard II and his reign as King of England. I don't know when, way back. One of the perks, or downfall, depending upon your kind of point of view, is that this is a play written almost entirely in verse. In Shakespeare's other plays, there are sections where characters speak in prose, especially if they're like a peasant or a servant or a gardener, but not so in here, which means that every line is in essence poetry. There's a lot of really good stuff. My favorite lines, I'm going to like read you a chunk, is from John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt is Richard II's uncle, and he is also the father of the next king, Henry IV. So there's this really cute, adorable scene. Richard II has just banished Henry, well, no, his name is Bolingbroke at this point. So he's just banished Bolingbroke, who will become the future King Henry IV. And John of Gaunt is talking with his son, and his son's really bummed because he's just been banished for 6 years. And this is what Dad John has to say. All places that the eye of heaven visits are to a wise man ports and happy havens. Teach thy necessity to reason thus. There is no virtue like necessity. Think not the king did banish thee, but thou the king. Woe doth the heavier sit where it perceives it is but faintly born. Go, say I sent thee forth to purchase honor, and not the king exiled thee. Or suppose devouring pestilence hangs in our air, and thou art flying to a fresher clime. Look what thy soul holds dear. Imagine it to lie the way thou goest, not whence thou comest. Suppose the singing birds musicians, the grass whereon thou treadst the present strewed, the flowers fair ladies, and thy steps no more than a delightful measure or a dance. For gnarling sorrow hath less power to bite the man that mocks at it and sets it light. And his son replies, Oh, who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking on the frosty Caucasus, or cloy the hungry edge of appetite by bare imagination of a feast, or wallow naked in December snow by thinking on fantastic summer's heat? Oh no! The apprehension of the good gives but the greater feeling to the worse. Fell sorrow's tooth doth never rankle more than when he bites, but lanceth not the sore. And then his father replies, Come, come, my son, I'll bring thee on thy way. Had I thy youth and cause, I would not stay. So if my reading didn't provide good comprehension for you, in essence, John of Gaunt saying, like, don't be sad that you're leaving. Like, don't pretend that you aren't banished. Pretend that I told you to go get your honor by traveling, or pretend that England is covered in like pestilence and it's a plague area and you're fleeing to fresher air because you don't want to die, or pretend that like all of the nature that you're going to be traversing are like fair maidens, and just use your imagination to make your banishment not so bad. And then his son's like, Dad, that's not gonna fix anything. Can you imagine that you're hot if you're out stuck in the snow naked? No, you're gonna still freeze your balls off. And then Gaunt says, well, I would totally leave if I was your age, so let's go. I just think it's really cute. I just really like it. So I'm going to stop talking about this. I'm currently rereading it because the first time I read it, I was more like, what's happening? And now I'm like, let me like highlight the good lines. So Richard II, 3 out of 5 stars the first time I read it, and let's see what I think when I reread it. And then I wanted to explore more classical literature, and I decided to like kind of go through the House of Atreus plays, which are all related to the Agamemnon issue that I told you about before with the Aeschylus, Oresteia. So this is Euripides, who also wrote on that, the House of Atreus and all their woes and stuff. So I read his play Iphigenia at Aulis, which talks about when Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia so that he could go to Troy. And then I also read Electra, which talks about the aftermath after murderous Clytemnestra gets the better of her husband Agamemnon when he comes back from the war. I didn't enjoy these nearly as much as the Oresteia, though I still would kind of rate them on 3 stars. I think that it's this translation though, so I'm going to get different translations from the library and see what I think about them. They're like, this is translated by Moses Hadas and John McLean, and it's like super snarky at times. Also, it's written out in prose form. I think that's just for like condensing sake, but it's not as fun to read as when it's in verse, like in the Oresteia I read. Let me tell you like some like really snarky crap. Now I'm gonna read it all snarky, but like this is why I just don't think it's this. I think it's this translation. Okay. So this is a note on like the text. So this is either Mr. Hadas or Mr. McLean. The text of this play appears to be seriously mutilated in several places. Some editors, for example, hold that the prologue as we have it is made up of fragments of 2 separate prologues. The ending of the play is obviously spurious. An apparently authentic fragment cited as from this play seems to come from a speech of Artemis, consoling Clytemnestra for the loss of her child. Just some of those, just kind of pain in the ass. Let me find another one, because there's more. There's also like a footnote, and instead of saying like, we did our best, but you know, these are ancient sources, it says text corrupt. We give what seems to be the approximate sense. Thanks. And then they're talking about like the ending, and again, they say, this item constitutes additional proof that the ending of the play as we have it is spurious. So it's just, I don't know, like mutilated, corrupt, spurious. It's a lot of attitude in those words. So yeah, they were fine. I want to read somebody else telling me about Euripides, though. I don't trust these guys. So then I also finally managed to listen to Dr. Thorn by Anthony Trollope in its entirety. Again, I'm listening to the audiobook narrated by David Shaw Parker. This was fine. This is Katie from Books and Things' least favorite of the Chronicles of Barsetshire books, and I totally understand why. She calls its plot conventional. I say that it's predictable. Yeah, some of the things that are happening in here are things that you've probably read, some themes and plot situations you've read in other Victorian literature or classics. But the main thing that tripped me up is that once you're introduced to all of the characters and their situations, you 100% know what has to happen by the end of this book. There's no question that the ducks are not going to line up exactly how they've been presented. And so there was definitely like no mystery in here for me. Perhaps that added a little bit to my impatience. But the other thing that I'm finding with Trollope is that no matter the length of his work, I feel like there's still too much repetition. Next time I read this, I'm going to count how many times the text, a character, or the character himself says, Frank must marry money. And I know this is like the major conflict in here, but it's like, you don't need to remind us, Mr. Trollope. We totally know that Frank needs to marry money and that this is the main crux of the novel. Like, we get it. So by the end, when this conflict is still yet to be resolved in the way that I knew it was going to be resolved from, page 50, it's like, I know, he has to marry money. So that was kind of something. But one thing I did really enjoy was Dr. Thorn and Mary Thorn. They're of a lesser class than some of the other characters that they are acquaintances with or even good family friends with in here. They definitely have sometimes a more modern look to what's more important, class or character, that I really enjoyed. I don't know how realistic their ideas would necessarily be, but for a modern reader, it was like, hell yeah, you know what I mean? Like, it was good. Anthony Trollope's writing style is delightful, and his narrator voice is also delightful. So this was still fun. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, but there was definitely no surprises. Like, the only surprise is that there are a couple characters who suffer from alcoholism. They're alcoholics to the point of death sort of thing, and just hearing about that, he doesn't shy away from this is a horrifying existence. You probably don't want to go down this route, reader. It was especially interesting to read right at the same time and after The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. So yeah, that was Dr. Thorn. Looking forward to continuing with Framley Parsonage in a bit, maybe in April. And then the final thing I finished was an audiobook. It was nonfiction. Meg Jo Beth Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Still Matters by Anne Boyd Rue. This explores Little Women. It explores a quick biography of Louisa May Alcott. It explores the history of the publication of Little Women, the different editions of Little Women, the movie adaptations of Little Women, the influence that Little Women, the book, and Jo March, the character, has specifically had on different important figures in our current and less current times. Then it finally starts talking about feminist interpretations in the 1970s, 1980s, Little Women's place in academia, Little Women's place in the classroom, if Little Women is still a text that modern readers, especially child readers, can connect with, enjoy, or should be exposed to. And I think I got everything. So this covers a lot. I definitely connected more with the latter half of the book, which looks at what the themes that Little Women explores, how we can look at them differently now, and then the question of, should kids still be reading it? Should it still be taught in classrooms? I was absolutely infuriated when the text talks about teachers who refuse to teach Little Women because they don't want to alienate their male student readers, their male students, but they don't have any qualms about potentially alienating their female readers when reading things like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and all of the other multitude of books that you're made to read in school that are written by white dudes or about white dudes or boys. In this book, Boyd Rue says that this is kind of, in the early 2000s, there was a crisis of young men readers, and the school system was just kind of losing their crap about the guys aren't reading. How can we pander to them? Apparently Shannon Hale, who is a middle grade author who most of her books have female protagonists, she wrote a blog post, and Boyd Rue talks about it, where she would go to schools to do presentations, but boys would be disinvited or discouraged from attending these assemblies. Shannon Hale's thing was why? Why are we discouraging or not encouraging our young men to empathize with women by being in the minds of them by reading fiction that has a female protagonist or is written by a woman? Shannon Hale asserts that this adds to the rape culture that is currently in America, the idea that women need to understand men but men don't need to understand women. It got me really angry, but in like a good way. I liked this. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It totally earned it. I can understand why some people would enjoy this more. I personally found the first section had more kind of like, I need to list all of this proof and evidence because no one's going to believe me if I don't, about how important Little Women has been. And for me, it was just kind of like, but it's just still lists and stuff. And can we get to like, picking apart the text and talking about why boys should read Little Women? So yeah, I enjoyed it though. And I think that if you really love Little Women or are like me and just really into the thought of this book, then you should pick it up. But if you haven't read Little Women, this will spoil Little Women. And if you aren't interested in this specific book's impact, then you'll also be super bored. So know who you are and know what the book's target audience is. So I think I'm finally done talking. Thank you for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely.